I put the wrong thing. Where is it? Okay, what's that? All right, okay, one second. Oh yeah, is it working? Yeah, it's working. No, okay. Okay. So I just sent around my the PDF of my slides, so you've got that, so you can pick them as I go along. So what I want to talk about is virtuous education and neuromedia. It's a bit of a smorgasbord. It's basically covers several topics that I've worked on recently, which I think are relevant to the theme, but hopefully it'll be a good thing for discussion. Okay. So here's what I want to talk about. And thanks very much to the organizers, Alejandro, especially for inviting me to speak. So I want to talk about the epistemic goals of education. My view is that education, from an epistemic point of view, should be understood as the development of intellectual character, whereby that I mean the cultivation of intellectual virtues, and I'm going to say a bit about that. Then I want to talk about extended cognition and neuromedia. And what I'm interested in here is the certain challenge that poses to education. And particularly, there's a certain kind of parochial views of education, which I think would educational practices start to become very problematic if we think that extended cognition and in particular neuromedia are common. I think that they don't pose a problem for education, but I think understanding why that is highlights the need to think of education in terms of, specifically in terms of the cultivation of intellectual character, virtuous intellectual character. And then I want to talk about some case studies, all studies that I've been involved in and how they bear here. The first is a prison education initiative that I was involved in Scotland. The second is a university-based curriculum project that I'm running right now. And then the third, which Lorena and Alejandro will be familiar with already, is an extended cognition project related to special needs education. This is a project back in Scotland. The first two, I think, illustrate quite nicely the educational role of cultivating intellectual character. And then the last, I think, illustrates how extended cognition and neuromedia might fit within such an educational project. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So this is very theoretical and applied. That's the idea. Okay, so education clearly serves many goals: social, political, practical, ethical. But it seems to me that one fundamental goal is epistemic. And in fact, I would put the point even more strongly than that, which is that the epistemic goal of education is some sense fundamental or foundational or something like that. I mean, think about, for example, conceptions of education as serving a civic function. So this is one very familiar idea, that education, one of its goals is to create informed citizens in a democratic society and so forth. But of course you can't, that's a social and political goal, but you can't achieve that goal if you don't have a sort of epistemic underpinning to it, right? You can't create informed citizens unless you inform them, right? And so on. And I think that's generally right. A putative educational practice that was unconcerned with epistemic goals wouldn't really be an educational practice at all. Even if it might go under the name, it wouldn't really be educational. It would be something else. It would be an indoctrination or something like that. So education is fundamental to education, and that raises an interesting question. What are the epistemic goals of education? Clearly, it does have epistemic goals, as I just said. Good inquirers, students know useful information, have useful cognitive skills, and so on. But I think it would be very implausible to think that the goal, the overarching goal, epistemic goal of education is simply to do that. I want to suggest actually the most plausible conception is one in which we're cultivating intellectual character. And there's more than one way of thinking about intellectual. So by intellectual character, I mean the sort of integrated whole of the subject, not just particular states or particular traits of the subject, but the integrated cognitive whole. And there are different ways of thinking about that, but I think the most plausible way of thinking about it is quite a rich conception in terms of the intellectual virtues. As we'll see, there are thinner conceptions. The intellectual virtues, I'm sure you know, they're admirable intellectual character traits: curiosity, intellectual humility, integrity, and so on. Now, you can see, I think, the plausibility of this way of thinking about the overarching epistemic goal of education by considering the alternatives. So, I mean, I'm going to make this very simple and crude because I don't want to get bogged down in the issue today, but there's a very parochial way of thinking about education, according to which it's just giving people certain epistemic states and certain basic cognitive skills. I don't think any educationalist these days actually thinks this, but it's a very popular view, I think, in the wider public, you know, in the media and so on. I mean, in Britain, we used to have this this debate that would crop up every few years where people would say, in the media would say, you know, our students, they don't know certain facts, they don't know enough about the Magna Carta or 1066 or something like that. And there'd be some general uproar about this. And the idea was we're not properly educating our kids. So implicit there is the idea that education really is about, you know, getting certain facts and skills into kids. But it's clearly problematic from an educational perspective. I mean, one way to think about this is, if you think that that's all education is about, then it's not really clear why we need educators. I mean, a security guard might perform that role just as well, right? I mean, just have children, like, you know, in a sort of factory style education, and just have them rote learning things and have someone, you know, an enforcer making sure they do this. We don't think of that as a good educational practice. Indeed, we don't think of that as an educational practice at all. And I think that reveals something interesting about what we think education is about. It's not just about these. We do obviously want students to know things and gain cognitive skills, but we want them to do something else too. And I think that's developing this intellectual character. Now, of course, as I mentioned a moment ago, there are different ways of thinking about intellectual character, the thinner or thicker ways. I'm going to say a little bit about that. I want to go straight for a quite robust sense of intellectual character, which is virtuous intellectual character. But there's also these thinner notions, like, for example, critical thinking. Some people talk about critical thinking skills or critical rational skills here. So just general skills about being able to sift and respond to reasons and evidence and so on. I think they're also important, but I don't think that captures the full story. To explain why, though, I think we need to go for the stronger view and then compare it with the weaker view. So let me do that. So let's think about the intellectual virtues. What are they? What do I mean by them? I take a broadly Aristotelian approach. This isn't an exhaustive list, but here's a range of features that, on the Aristotelian approach, intellectual virtues have. They incorporate a distinctive motivational state. It's very important. A love of the truth, a desire for accuracy, a desire to avoid error. This is very important. You know, so you can manifest traits that superficially look like intellectual virtues, but if they're not actually motivated by this desire for the truth, then they're not genuine intellectual virtues. As you'll see, that's an important contrast with critical thinking skills. They don't have to have this motivational state. The intellectual virtues are acquired and maintained in a distinctive fashion. You're not born with them. They're not innate. Once acquired, you have to keep cultivating them. They can be lost. Again, different from other kinds of, some kinds of cognitive skills on that score. You acquire them ideally by emulation of exemplars. In fact, ideally actual exemplars, although that's not necessary. And also through a process of habituation. I mean, you can think of this kind of like an intellectual gym or something like that. It's the habituation that makes these habits of thought second nature. And this relates to the sense in which they're reflective. The intellectual virtues are essentially reflective in their cultivation, but not necessarily in their manifestation. In fact, actually, if you've mastered the virtues, then and they're second nature to you, then you don't have to be reflective. You can just spontaneously manifest them, which is, I think, quite interesting because they in a sense, the intellectual virtues that are amenable to a sort of intellectualized account of their acquisition, but not necessarily of their manifestation.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. I think the slides are not showing.
Oh, sorry.
I'm seeing the cover. I don't know if everyone else is.
Oh, right. Okay, we're on slide You're not seeing the slides. Sorry,
Not yet.
they're showing on my screen. It's on screen share. So
okay, sorry.
okay, let's try sharing the screen again then. I don't know what's going on. It's strange.
Yeah.
Okay, what are you seeing now?
Yeah. Now I'm seeing.
Okay. Right. So here the slide you missed then. Sorry. This was the slide. So that was the structure of the talk. I guess you missed that one. Right. Okay.
Yeah. We had the PDF, so.
Okay. Right. So okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So we're on this slide. Intellectual virtues. Right. So the virtues, I think intellectual virtues, like all virtues, lie between two vices, a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency. And part of the skill of acquiring the intellectual virtues is being able to navigate between these two vices. So think about the virtue of curiosity. There's a virtue, there are certain traits of excess here, which you need to avoid, which would be sort of excessive curiosity. So, being interested in lines of questioning that are just irrelevant or pointless or what have you. And then there's also a vice of deficiency, being lacking in curiosity. The virtues have a special kind of value in terms of how they enable us to flourish. I think this is right, but this is, of course, a contentious claim. I'm not going to be arguing for it today. I'll just simply point it out. Related to this, they promote certain kinds of goods, which are very important. Epistemic autonomy, they enable people to think for themselves. Active knowing, I mean, the intellectual virtues are all about active knowing rather than just being passive recipients of information and skills, right? The idea is that it always involves an active engagement. And related to that again, and they're about seeking understanding. The virtuous inquirer isn't content merely just simply to get the answer. They want to understand the answer. They want to see how things fit together. They want to. Something I've written about before is that this idea of getting to the truth isn't just, as it were, understood piecemeal. It's understood sort of globally. It's about getting a kind of grip on the way things are, which involves an understanding of the way things are, because that's seeing how truths fit together. They're integrating one another. The intellectual virtues are not piecemeal. I mean, this is generally true of character traits, but especially the intellectual virtues. You can't develop intellectual virtue. You can't develop an individual intellectual virtue without developing, in some sense, all of them. Of course, there are stronger and weaker versions of that. The very strong views, the unity of the virtues view, you develop them all at once. But even if you don't go that route, I mean, the thought is, as character traits in developing one part of character, you're developing character as a whole. And what's very important here is they can't be, by definition, inconsistent with one another. They can't be the sorts of traits that are in conflict. Something I think is very important when you think about them as guiding education. And then they perform a managerial role in one's cognitive architecture. So they're the kinds of traits that help you to make cognitive decisions. So that if you've got your skills and your epistemic states, what do you do with them? Well, this is the sort of job for the intellectual virtues to do. It's that part of your cognitive character that's going to make those decisions, which is why it's very important that you have it. Okay, so that's the sort of rich conception of intellectual character. I think you can see the contrast with critical thinking skills and see why they're thinner. The way it works, I think, is that the virtuous intellectual character entails a kind of critical rational intellectual character, but not vice versa. I mean, in particular, you can have critical rational character without having any concern for the truth. I mean, think about a lawyer. You can train up a lawyer to be a fantastic lawyer, great at reasoning in the courtroom and showing off their expertise, all these epistemic traits. But there's no reason why they should care about the truth. They can manifest all that without caring about it. And I think this is true of critical thinking skills. You can develop them in a way that doesn't have any real concern for the truth. Interestingly, once you do add that in, then it starts to become unclear what really the difference is between critical thinking skills and intellectual virtues. I mean, if the lawyer really isn't caring for the truth, then how is what they're doing now not intellectually virtuous, right? I'm not saying that's a settled question. I'm just saying it becomes unclear now exactly what the difference is. In any case, what I'm interested in is this thought. In education, we're educating for intellectual virtue, not simply for epistemic states, cognitive skills, or even thin notions of intellectual character, because I think we really want this motivational state in there. Now, let me just say before I get on to the applied stuff, which is really relevant to this seminar, I want to give one example of why this is important. And it's an example which, it's a perennial example actually, but I think it takes on a particularly stated form in the modern world. The problem of disagreement. So disagreement has always been with us, obviously. It always created epistemic challenges, but it seems to me that the epistemic challenges it creates far more marked, far more acute in the information age. As I say here, how do we navigate epistemic environments? Multiple sources of information, often involving conflicting viewpoints. Misleading information is rife. The experts aren't obvious. And this is the situation all of us find ourselves in when we get onto social media, for example. So the problem of disagreement takes on this new form. And I think that part of the solution for this, dealing with this, lies in educating for the intellectual virtues, and in particular, not just critical thinking. I mean, I think critical thinking skills are good, but of course, I'm thinking of them as a component of the intellectual virtues. Notice I say part of the solution. I think you need structural solutions too. I'm not suggesting that the individual can solve this. In fact, I think that clearly they can't. But so here I'm interested in just what is it that the individual can do, or what we can do to help the individual to solve it. I think here the virtues become important, educating for the virtues. So consider, for example, the overarching importance of caring for the truth as opposed to, say, winning an argument. Educated with critical thinking skills, I think, isn't going to give you the contrast you want here. What we really want is the former, not the latter. And in fact, I think to me, a lot of the problems that emerge, social media disagreements emerge precisely because there is the latter and not the former. We also need very rich traits as well. So think about intellectual imagination, which I think is a virtue. A willingness to actually explore different and opposing viewpoints, to have that a certain kind of willingness to actually think through opposing and contradictory thought. That's the sort of thing I think which is a very rich kind of character trait. I think it's part of what is involved in a virtuous intellectual character, but wouldn't necessarily be involved in thinner conceptions of intellectual character. Being intellectually conscientious, being careful about what reasons you have, what evidence you have, but also I think related to this, arguing with integrity. So this isn't just the case of, I mean, it is involved in being honest, but it's more than that. It's charitably construing one's opponent, being fair to one, not to your infallibility, to opposing opinions. I think of humility trait as just how you think about yourself. I don't think that's quite right. I think it's actually more importantly how you relate to others. And I think you manifest intellectual humility having genuine respect for others and their opinions and intellectual respect. And the integration point comes back here, I think. And this is one thing that is sort of built into my curriculum project, which I'll talk about later briefly. It's very important to understand, for example, how intellectual humility is compatible with intellectual tenacity, right? They're both, but they're not in common. I think there are a certain false way about both traits that makes, they can't, like, having conviction is incompatible with being intellectually humble. Conviction, then no, you won't listen to other people. And if you do listen to other people, you lack conviction. I think this is a sort of conceptual error. It's not what they're involved in. So understanding how these different virtuous traits can coexist and actually be compatible, I think, which is what you get when you teach for virtuous intellectual character, is very important in terms of cultivating these skills in the right kind of way. Having intellectually humble people who have conviction, having people that have conviction being also intellectually humble, so on. Okay, let me now get to extended cognition. So I'm sure you're all familiar with extended cognition, but this is the idea that a particular kind of cognitive process occurs when features of the subject's environment, we're going to be focusing on technology, but it could just be physical features of the environment, or it could be social features of the environment. In particular, we're interested in information processing technology, as I'll explain. When they become sufficiently integrated into the subject's onboard cognitive processes, that they become proper parts of those cognitive processes. So this is often called vehicle externalism. I think that's a nice way of thinking about it. The vehicle of cognition can extend beyond, the brain, central nervous system of the subject, in fact, beyond the skin and skull of the subject, and take in environmental features of the subject's environment. So I'm not saying this is an uncontroversial example, but think about how certain cognitive functions like memorial functions become offloaded onto one's smartphone. Personally, by the way, I don't think this is extended cognition, I'll explain, but a lot of people think that it is. The idea is smartphone is always with you. If you have the right kind of relationship to that technology, then we could start to think of this as a sort of extended memorial cognitive function. So you've got your sort of onboard biological memory, you've got your not on board, your non-biological memory, and they're both functioning together to provide you with to perform certain memorial tasks. If you think of it that way, it isn't just, your relationship to the technology now isn't just simply subject and instrument. It's a kind of cognitive augmentation. And then if there's extended cognition, then it seems like conditions extended cognition all to lead to extend. That's a big topic, something I've written a lot about, but I'm not going to get into this today. I'll take that transition there from extended cognition to extended knowledge is fairly uncontentious. It actually isn't. But a lot of the reasons I don't think why it isn't, we don't have to worry about here. But I'll just mention one because it might be something that you'll be thinking as we go along with this. There may be certain features of extended cognitive processes, especially the kind of neuromedia that I'm going to come to in a moment, which is such that although they are genuinely extended cognitive processes, they're actually knowledge undermining rather than knowledge promoting. You might think about certain kind of ways in which neuromedia could be developed where even if it gives us true beliefs, maybe it gives us true beliefs in the wrong kind of way, maybe in epistemically problematic ways. That gives it gives us true beliefs in a way, let's say, by shielding off other true beliefs we might have formed. Let's say other true beliefs that might have been politically problematic or something like that. Then you can see ways in which the extended cognition doesn't lead to extended knowledge. But I'm not going to get into that. That's I think, a great topic, but that's a different topic, what we're going to talk about today. I'll just take it as granted that extended knowledge can be gained. So one question about extended cognition. I just mentioned, I don't think smartphones are extended cognition. I don't think the way ordinary people use ordinary smartphones is extended cognition, but lots of people do. There's kind of two main elements to this debate. One main element is some people just think the very idea of extended cognition is incoherent in some way. That's one view. I'm not really going to engage with that today. I'm more interested in the second kind of view, which is debates about the threshold. And I think a lot of the discussion is of that form. What's the threshold? How do you clear it for extended cognition? So the idea is there can be extended cognitive processes, but what does it take? Clark and Chalmers, their famous case from that paper was Otto, which I think is a terrible case. I just don't find it remotely convincing. So if you remember, Otto has dementia, and then he starts using a notebook, and to compensate for the fact that he's losing his memory. And then the idea is the notebook becomes part of his extended cognitive process. I should say, by the way, interesting feature about that paper, the Clark and Chalmers, if you know that paper well, they take extended cognition actually for granted in that paper. What they're really interested in is the extended mind. So they're arguing for this idea that mental states can be, in fact, they actually say mental states are outside the skin and skull subject, which is, I think, they don't put it that way now, and I think rightly so. Mental states they're not anywhere, right? So they can't be inside or outside because they're not anywhere, properly thinking. But of course, they're the more careful. This is a point about vehicle cognition and so on. So really, it's the extended mind. Interesting question how the extended mind relates to the extended cognition. It depends whether you think the mark of the mental is cognitive. But in that paper, they take extended cognition gets mentioned, but it's taken as kind of an obvious truth, even though it's actually really contentious. I'm interested in the extended cognition claim. But Otto is meant to illustrate both. Otto, his beliefs are, as it were, outside the head. The vehicle of that mental state is partly outside the head. That's what they mean. But more importantly, the idea is that cognitive process is taking in features of the environment, the notebook. And the rationale we're given I mean, in the paper itself, we're given the parity principle, which has been very influential. It's on the handout here. It basically just means that there's a functional equivalence. Insofar as there's a functional equivalence between, the way normal memory works and the way this now putative extended cognitive process works, well, then it really is a genuine cognitive process. So we shouldn't be sort of bio-prejudiced or something like that. We shouldn't, privilege cognitive processes just because they take place in the head. If they're functionally equivalent to these other processes that don't take place in the head, then they're all cognitive processes. There's also the famous glue and trust conditions, which Andy Clark has done a lot of work on. Interesting question how they relate to the parity principle. One way of viewing them is they're just kind of ways of fleshing that out in practice. But I mean, the three conditions that have sort of stuck: the resource is reliably available and typically invoked, information received is more or less automatically endorsed, or at least as much as the corresponding biological form of cognition. The information contained in the resource is easily accessible as and when required. Otto's notebook seems to meet these conditions. The notebook's with him all the while. He endorses it regularly. It's not just scribblings on a piece of paper. This is his notebook for his things he needs to remember and so on. It's in his handwriting and so forth. It's as trustworthy as his biological memory. I mean, one thing Clark makes a lot of is the fact that, our ordinary cognitive processes, although they're internal in the relevant sense, they can sometimes be a bit cumbersome, a bit clunky and so on. So it's not an inherent problem with these external cognitive processes that they're also sometimes a bit, they require a bit of thought or a bit, maybe a bit of prompting to get to, you got to scrabble around a bit to find the notebook. Well, you have to kind of scrabble around a bit mentally to dig out the memories and so on. So the thought is, when we look at ordinary cognition, properly, we'll see that these extended cognitive processes have the same properties. So if you think this is the criteria for extended cognition, then it looks like a lot of things for extended cognition. I'm sort of the camp that extended cognition isn't quite as common as we think, but what I'm more interested in is something slightly different. I'm going to, for our purpose anyway, is a kind of extended cognition I'm going to call neuromedia. So I formulated this, Andy Clark and we ran this project back in Edinburgh almost a decade ago now. It's hard to think how much time's passed. On extended knowledge, it was called. It was about extended cognition and its epistemic implications. And as part of that project, we got to meet a lot of industry people who work. A lot of these companies, IBM, Google, Microsoft, they have a kind of division, which is basically theorists who are sort of theorizing about the technology, and like they're trying to keep track of the literature and trying to sort of formulate, like trying to get it ahead of what the new movements are going to be. And talking to them, it seemed to us that what they were trying to develop, because they're really interested in extended cognition and the technological implications of it, as you can imagine, what they're really interested in developing, it seemed to me, was this thing neuromedia. And it's a particular kind of extended cognition. So well, let me just read this out. So we're talking about information processing technology here. Not all extended cognitive processes involve information processing technology. I mean, a lot of the really interesting cases, actually, I think, are embodied cases of extended cognition. So lots of really interesting work on hand use. Gesticulation as being an aid to cognition. Certain cognitive tasks, like certain imaginative tasks, for example, are harder if you don't have access to your hands. You can't move them, which is really interesting. So it seems like your embodiment is playing a cognitive role. But obviously, that's not information processing. I mean, I guess it could be, but it usually isn't. But clearly, the technology we're interested in is information processing. It's an extended cognitive process, and it has the following feature. The information processing technology is so seamlessly integrated with the onboard cognitive processes that the subject is often, or let's say in the moment, unable to distinguish between the use of the onboard processes and the technology itself. I mean, this seemed to be like the dream of the technology. So you've got like, so at that time, everything was about wearable tech. I think it's become more sort of, the big buzz thing now is actually internal tech. But wearable tech that's just kind of, you're not even aware that you're wearing it, sort of thing. It's so unobtrusive. You can see what's going on here. You want the seamless integration of the tech to be such that, let's take the memorial case. whatever device is playing the artificial role, whether you're using that or whether you're using biological memory, well, they'll just be the same kind of thing. They'll just be integrated in such a way that, yeah, you might have to think, maybe if you think about it, you can work out which is which, but you won't necessarily know in the moment which is which. So if you can get that, then of course that's going to ensure that your relationship to that instrument is not one of subject and instrument. You won't even feel like an instrument. It will feel just like your biological memory. So the phenomenology of your engagement with it will be completely different. So you'd have a kind of cognitive augmentation where the phenomenology is identical to non-augmented cognitive processes. And that's what I mean by neuromedia. I think this is kind of like the goal of extended cognitive processes, of people who are developing that technology. And I think if we had extended cognition like this, then I think it would clearly, whatever the threshold is, it clearly crosses that threshold. So this is what interests me. Neuromedia, if in the future a lot of our cognitive processes are extended cognitive processes in this sense, then what follows? Think in particular of the challenge that this poses for education. Imagine a future world where many of our cognitive processes can be offloaded to neuromedia. If you think education is just about giving people epistemic states and certain basic cognitive skills, it's not clear what the point of education is. I mean, really, education now, the whole project of it, we shouldn't have teachers. What we should have is engineers. And what we should do is just kind of upgrade. It's just a process of upgrades and maybe helping people adapt to the upgrades. What's left of the educational process, exactly? On the other hand, we might think, and I think we do think, that there's still an educational project to be had, even in the context of this widespread cognitive augmentation. And then that now is the challenge. Well, why is there still an educational project? In particular, why can't you just offload this educational project to the technology as well? So here's the idea, intellectual virtue, it seems, would still be a goal of education, even in this context, this augmentation. So, but why can't that be offloaded? It's very interesting when we had the discussion with we had these workshops with these tech people came in and talked to us, and when I ran this by, I remember the one guy from IBM, absolutely adamant when the intellectual. I mean, he got it. Well, it wasn't like he was misunderstanding the intellectual virtues, but he got it. And he's like, no, you can easily offload that. Everyone's agreeing, yeah, you can easily it might be difficult, but you can offload that to tech, no problem. I don't think you can, but I think it's really interesting. Why can't you, right? And I think it highlights something interesting about how we're thinking about it. So that's the key question. Why can the intellectual virtues be offloaded in the way I'm granting that epistemic states and basic cognitive skills can be? Right? I think I'm imagining a future where in fact they are. If they can't, there is a puzzle there, because after all, intellectual virtues are themselves a kind of cognitive skill, right? I mean, that's what they are. They're not a special kind of cognitive skill, but they are a cognitive skill. Moreover, I think everyone should grant that the technology can help you to be virtuous, right? That seems right. I mean, here's a kind of like toy case I've just put down on the PowerPoint. You can imagine, so we have, in social sciences, there are certain ways of measuring closed minds, dogmatic attitudes, and so on. There are certain questionnaires and so on. In fact, in terms of speech analysis, you can pick up on certain patterns which highlight sort of dogmatic ways of thinking. So if and there's there's reasonably good empirical work done on this kind of thing and what it's a predictor for and so on. But if that's right, then surely we could develop technology which looks at what you write and what you say and speech patterns and so on, and identifies when you're sort of going down dogmatic routes and sort of prompts you to reflect on your performance or whatever, prompts you to think, alerts you to the fact you're being a bit dogmatic, maybe makes you think again about it. You can imagine a technology like that being used as maybe as part of some other suite of resources to help people to be more intellectually virtuous. So I don't think that doesn't seem controversial. So if you can do that, why can't you sort of build on that and actually make the intellectual virtues extended cognitive processes? Why can't you just have neuromedia that replaces them? So I would suggest there's a range of reasons why they're not offloadable in this way. I think one aspect relates to the managerial role they play. They're, as it were, they're not in the right place in our cognitive architecture for the offloading. As it were, the intellectual virtues are the sorts of things that manage the particular skills, which are of a kind, the piecemeal skills of a kind that can be offloaded to technology. It's the virtuous intellectual character that governs the use of specific cognitive skills and epistemic states of a kind that could be offloaded to technology. I mean, this suggests a certain picture where, with the extended cognition literature, those sort of extreme people have taken more extreme view and less extreme view. I know Andy's view is more along these lines, actually, that the possibility of extended cognition presupposes some aspect of cognitive character which is not itself extended. And I think that's right. And I think talk about the intellectual virtues highlights that. We need to think of there being some part of the cognitive character which is playing this managerial role. And, obviously it can be good intellectual character or bad intellectual character. I'm saying virtuous intellectual character, the good intellectual character. That's what you want. The good intellectual character playing this managerial role, but something is going to be playing this managerial role in the normal run of events. Related to this is the motivational state. We want, as I said, this isn't an optional feature. I don't know how you would engineer for that. Someone might tell me, maybe a cognitive science of the future would tell me that we can engineer for it, but it looks to me like this is part of something that belongs to the character and not to the extended states. And then I think it also relates to the active and reflective nature of the intellectual virtues. It strikes me that the kinds of cognitive skills that are more easy to think of being replaced by neuromedia are precisely the sort of the passive ones. We think of sort of, where it's just sort of information receiving type skills. I mean, some people talk about Google Glasses in the context of this. You can imagine just sort of information popping up. So you've got your perceptual information, and you've got this other information. Maybe over time, you don't start to distinguish what comes through your perception, what comes through that. But in both cases, it's kind of like a passive reception of information. Different from what the intellectual virtues aren't about that. They're about this active and reflective way of engaging with information. In particular, often it's downstream from the passive. So you've got so think of perception versus observation. Now, perception is the passive visual perception I'm talking about here. The passive reception of visual information. Observation is sort of the interrogation of that visual information. So, as it were, again, the intellectual virtues are appearing in a different part of the cognitive economy, and so that's why they're not being offloaded. I should say, by the way, I meant to mention this when I talked about neuromedia. The tech, as I said, back when we were talking to these industry people, the big thing was wearable tech, but now it's moved towards internal tech. You think of Elon Musk and the sort of stuff he's up to. But this is quite interesting. Neuromedia might well be inside the skin and skull of the subject. In fact, that would be ideal, because the more internal it is, the less obtrusive it is, and the easier it's going to be to make it feel like your engagement with it is not one of subject and object. If there's like a physical distance you have to traverse in order to engage with the tech, that's going to emphasize its dislocation from you. If there isn't that, then it doesn't get emphasized. Another related idea here, which I think is important when we think about neuromedia, is there's at least two different ways it could go. We tend to think of it down what's called the cyborg route, where we think of it as just upgrades to the individual. But actually, that's a very costly way of doing cognitive augmentation. Another route is to think of it in terms of more of sort of an environmental upgrade. So you have modest upgrades to the individual, but you have ways in which the individual can link to environmental resources. So this is sometimes called the Minority Report route. If you remember from that film, there's lots of information processing going on in the environment, which is bespoke to you. It picks up on you and then gives you, actually gives you really bad information, which goes back to our point about extended cognition, whether it leads to knowledge. But, imagine now an environment that gives you good information, which is bespoke to you. So the resources, as it were, in the environment, this would be a more cost-effective way of doing cognitive augmentation for lots of people. So, I mean, this has a bearing on the educational context, right? What we could imagine both occurring in educational context, maybe highly technologically embedded environments or highly technologically augmented individuals. Okay, let me, now I won't talk much longer, but let me just say a little bit about the applied projects and how they manifest this. I just want to mention three. First is a philosophy in prisons project I ran in Scotland. We were trying to bring philosophy or something broadly philosophy-like, as we'll see, into prison education. There wasn't really any prison education in Scotland at the time. I mean, there were art classes and things like that, sort of ways of keeping prisoners busy, but not really educational programs. One thing I'm very proud of is the fact that there is now a nationwide education program in Scottish prisons, which is precisely this we're describing. So this now has a life of its own, which is great. So what we did was we used a technique. It's called Community of Philosophical Inquiry. It's rooted in the work of Lippmann. It's a sort of actually philosophy for children work. Although I think I've been trying to like drag it away from that connotation of it being about kids, because I think everyone can benefit from this approach. We're particularly interested in a way of developing this that was due to McCall. It's a way of sort of, as I've argued, a way of sort of teaching pure thinking. So what you do is it's a way of like having a discussion that strips away everything extraneous and just focuses on reasons, your reasons, other people's reasons. And there are certain rules of play, certain techniques you have to train the educator, the facilitator really. And then they then have to train the group, and then the group develops as a group. They learn these rules of play, and then they sort of develop a group identity, and they engage with certain cognitive issues and puzzles, and they engage with them collectively, and they learn over time to develop ways of thinking. What they're doing is they're learning how to reason. It's really interesting. So it's a fascinating thing to watch. As I say, it gets done with kids, and it's very effective with kids. You can have very young kids, 7-year-olds, and so on. You can get them engaging with very quite sophisticated topics from a philosophical point of view. But I think it's great with anyone, actually. And I've argued elsewhere, it's kind of like, if you think education is about the development of the intellectual virtues, then this is kind of like a pure way of doing it, because it's a way of just getting people to think about thinking in a very general sense. By the way, this artwork on the slide here, was made by one of the prisoners. This is actually a prison door. Okay, so we ran this. We trained up so there were educators they're already involved in prison education, and actually the art projects and so on, which is really important because they had the relationship with the prisoners. So you're already one of the big drawbacks of getting into prison education, forming a relationship with the prisoners. That hurdle has already been cleared. We trained them up in this coping methodology, and then we sort of created the structure of the seminars that the prisoners would do, and then we ran it, and everything was recorded, and we did sort of discourse analysis on the conversations. And we sort of set various tasks for the prisoners to do at different intervals. Not really, didn't matter whether they solved the task. What was interesting, how did they approach the tasks? And we try and look for ways of development of intellectual character. Great thing about COPI, by the way, and this is why it's used in schools, is it presupposes no background knowledge whatsoever. And you don't even need to be able to read and write. Now, this is really important in prison context, because obviously I have paper. I have the sources for all this at the end. You can have a look. Many of the prisoners, in fact, I think part of the reason why they're in prison is that they're illiterate. They have very poor educational backgrounds. So you can't have an educational project that presupposes literacy or presupposes certain kinds of background and factual knowledge. COPE is perfect in this regard. So we had this study running alongside, and we were looking at the development of their cognitive skills, and it was really quite striking, the results. Development of really important, I think, cognitive skills, intellectual concern for others, respect for accuracy and the truth, intellectual self-respect. In fact, in the paper, we identify 4 main areas: critical reasoning skills, intellectual openness, intellectual respect for others, intellectual self-respect. So you can measure these things, or at least social scientists tell you can measure these things. The dogmatism, for example, students scored really high on scores for dogmatism. I mean, they just weren't really interested in other people. It was really quite striking, and their ideas. In fact, everyone at the beginning, everyone's off in their own little world. The discourse analysis is really interesting. Very little engagement. very little, in terms of sort of accurate representation of other people's views, it's pretty much nil. By the end, massive increase there. And I think this is really, respect for the truth, intellectual respect for others, self-respect. I think it's very telling these all come together. You develop one aspect of character, you develop all. We were focusing on intellectual character, but I think it helps character more generally. If you have intellectual respect for others, you have respect for others. And respect for others is that's like an ethical category. It's not specifically intellectual and so on. In any case, the point was, show clear developments in their intellectual character. They perform better on other kinds of educational tasks as well. And it was because of the good results that we were able to get this project expanded. So I think this project highlights, because the point about the intellectual virtues in education, because I think this is in a pure way that what we're doing is teaching for intellectual virtue. I mean, not explicitly, that's important because of the contrast to the other project I'll mention in a moment, but implicitly we're teaching for intellectual virtue. Okay, now the second project, this is the curriculum project at UCI that I'm working on now. I'm very lucky because at UCI, we have institutional support from the Chancellor down to transform the curriculum. You normally don't get this, so you have to take advantage of it when you do get it. The idea is to bring the intellectual virtues into the heart of the curriculum. We've focused on four Peter the Anteater is the mascot of the UCI, so that's why we've got there. I'm not altogether happy with this, but we have their Anteater virtues. You have to do what you have to do to get these things through. So the four virtues we've gone for: curiosity, integrity, intellectual humility, and intellectual tenacity. Curiosity strikes me as an obvious one in an educational context. Integrity is very useful because it helps us, talk about issues about academic misconduct and so on, but do so in a much richer way than just simply don't plagiarize. We can talk about issues about, respect for others and respect for the truth and reasons and so on. Intellectual humility and intellectual tenacity, I think, are very useful for the reasons I gave earlier. It's important to see how they can be held in conjunction with one another. How being intellectually humble is compatible with having conviction, and vice versa, having conviction is compatible with being intellectually humble. I think this is a real important insight that students need to grasp. I think it's something that's very lost in the modern world. So we approached this with a suite of online modules, represent a range of disciplinary and historical perspectives. The historical perspective is important. This isn't just Western, we have Eastern perspectives and so on. The global South is represented and so on. So it's not just, I think it's very important in a project at this level that it's done in this broad and inclusive way. And these online modules are embedded into the curriculum at various points. So all students take it as part of their orientation before they come. They take these modules, and then they take certain modules as they progress through the curriculum. And then we've had an educational study running alongside this, looking at the effects. In particular, what we had students do are these need for cognition surveys. I'm sure you might be familiar with. They're very good ways of measuring, certain cognitive traits like curiosity, openness, and so forth. We're also able to get these results cross-reference against the student data set. That's got information like gender, ethnicity, educational background. Are they first-generation students? What are their results like coming into this and going out of it, and so on. And we're able to demonstrate the effect of this. Huge increase on the need for cognition scores. I mean, I say huge. It's obviously huge from a statistical point of view. Actually, I mean, quite small, but way more than we were expecting or anyone could reasonably expect from an intervention of this kind. And I mean, more interestingly, I think it didn't just help. I mean, so two things are interesting. One is that their performance improved. We can show improvement in their grades moving forward. Students who do this versus students that don't. At the moment, there's still students who do it, and students don't. At some point, it'll be everyone that does it. As it expands, but we're still at that point where we have like about a sizable chunk of the UCI student cohort have done it so far. But even more interestingly, the results are stable across demographic groups. Now, as I'm sure you know, educational interventions usually lead to improvements, because that's just what happens. But what you tend to find is the improvements improve people who are already doing well. So you'll have people who are strong educationally. When you have the intervention, they will get disproportionately the most benefit from it. Students who are struggling educationally get disproportionately the least benefit from it. But what we found with this was that the results were stable across groupings. It didn't matter whether you're male, female, whether you're underrepresented minority, whether you're low income background, first generation. It didn't matter what your educational background was coming in. So again, that's a really important result. And in fact, that results like that enabled us to go from the pilot to the actual full project. So again, this shows the importance of the intellectual virtues to education. But notice the difference between the prison's case. The prison's case, we're educating for intellectual virtue, but not explicitly. We haven't mentioned the virtues. It doesn't get mentioned at all to the student, to the prisoners. It's not relevant. Here, we're explicitly educating for intellectual virtue. And I think at this level, that's an important feature. So we're helping students now to think of their educational experience in terms of development of intellectual character. And it seems like that reinforces the positive effect of educating for intellectual virtues. And then the final project I want to mention is a project, Extended Cognition in Special Needs Education. This was a school in Scotland. We were looking at the use of technology in this special needs school, myself and social sciences. And we were interested in particular with assistive technology. I mean, the thought was this, that special needs schools are at the vanguard of the use of technology in education. They're highly technologically embedded environments. And so if we can see what's going on in special needs schools in terms of the use of education, this might tell us something interesting about mainstream schools. And more generally, we just wanted to understand how is this assistive technology used? Is it used as an extended cognitive process? The hypothesis was that it is. And indeed, that's exactly what we found. So what we were looking at was the way the students related to their technology, how they were taught, what were the practices and so on. And in time and again, we found that the relationship wasn't one of subject and instrument. That wasn't how it was described. In fact, the process of mastering the technology was described as overcoming that, getting beyond thinking of it as just an instrument, thinking of it as part, as they would say, part of you. I mean, a really interesting case here is, which we talk in the paper that accompanies this, is student Max. Max is blind, actually has other problems as well, but cognitively, but his blindness is the one that was interested to us. He had a Braille machine that was always with him. The technology was becoming obsolete, so they had to train him up on a new device. And this was really interesting. So we watched this process. He basically had a one-to-one, a teacher, Yakov, who worked with him. A lot of students in the school had severe issues, would have one-to-one relationship with their teacher, which I think, again, very interesting in terms of creating these support networks. But so we watched the process of Max learning the new Braille technology. The first technology he tried, it was cumbersome, unintuitive, he couldn't master it. It was becoming very frustrating. And then it was agreed that they would try another technology, and they found one was more intuitive, less cumbersome. And then there's this process of how working together, Max comes to master the technology, and they start to describe it in ways which are very much evocative of extended cognition. What the educational goal is the seamless integration of assistive technology. They don't, the students themselves, the educators don't think of the technology as mere instruments. They think of it as part of the cognitive subject. And this was reflected in their educational strategies. Moreover, the educational strategies weren't just about, giving them technology and getting students to use it, but it was about developing their intellectual character. So developing their resilience, for example, and developing their strategies for deal with technology. We hypothesized this was really the cultivation of intellectual virtues. The educationalists put this in terms of what they call productive struggle. So you have these scaffolded educational contexts where the student is engaged in productive struggle. So it's not just destructive struggle, actually it's going somewhere, they're learning something from it. And they're acquiring the traits they need in order to help them to use this technology. But those traits are both practical traits about the use of technology, but also these general character traits. And these are what we would say is the intellectual virtues. And then last slide, this relates to, there are two main conceptions of disability. I mean, historically, there was the medical model. This is the idea of disability basically in the individual. These days, people think in terms of the social model of disability. You think of it more as a relation between the subject and environment, a mismatch. And this changes the way we think about disability and how we should manage for it. And I think construing assisted technologies as extended cognition, and eventually we would think as neuromedia, shifts the focus of the environment from the physical and the social technology to the technological. And notice, by the way, we're focusing on information processing technology here, like the Braille machine. There's another debate to be had about, for example, the wheelchair. You know, wheelchairs are assisted technology, but they're not information processing. But if you think in terms of embodied cognition, then of course that makes sense. We're focusing more on the information processing. And this is a range of implications, sorry. You know, we should allow assisted technology in assessments, allow students to keep their assisted technology outside of school. Teachers should be trained to help cognitively integrate the assisted technology, as opposed to, it's not just a case of just handing it over to them, sort of thing. And in fact, the school embodied all of these implications. You know, in their practices, these implications were already manifested. Students were able to take the technology home with them, for example, at nighttime, holidays, and so forth. But they often, they said, had to justify this to external bodies. And you can see how the conversation would go. You know, this is expensive technology. What, you're letting the students take it home with them? But of course, if you think it relates to how they're thinking of that technology, if you think of this technology not just simply an instrument, but part of the cognitive character of the subject, then of course you let them take it home, right? I mean, it would be inhumane to not let them take it home. So same with, you know, assessment and so forth. So yeah, so I've argued the overarching epistemic goal of education, development, virtue and intellectual character, and by that I mean intellectual virtues. I've argued they can't be offload technology by extended cognition neuromedia, and I've argued we can see these points in application educational projects. The first two illustrate about the intellectual character as being the goal of education. The last one, I think, illustrates how we might think of extended cognition as functioning in educational contexts. And there's the references there. There's a new paper, by the way, on the prisons, which I can send anyone who's interested. And that's the end. Thanks. Sorry, I've talked quite a lot.
Thank you very much. We have some time for questions. So, does anybody? Yes, Diana.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this talk. It was awesome. The proposal in general is great, and the projects attached to it are awesome. Really, congratulations. So you mentioned something about Clark and Chalmers' argument that doesn't distinguish between extended mind and extended cognition. So what is your opinion about that? What is for you the difference between extended mind and extended cognition? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, there are these views that the mark of the mental is the cognitive. And if you think that, then obviously there's no difference. And I don't know what I think about that. I guess I'm inclined to think that, yeah, all my instincts tell me, my philosophical spidey sense tells me that there is a difference. But that's really the million-dollar question. Do you think the mark of the mental is the cognitive? If you do, then there isn't really a difference. I don't really have a stand on this. I mean, I differentiate them just because it's interesting to me that Clark and Chalmers thought that extended cognition was uncontroversial. And this reveals something about their background. I mean, it's not to epistemologists. I mean, I think epistemology shifted as a result of this, but at the time, individualism, epistemic individualism, this idea that the kind of traits that lead to epistemic states are things that go on inside the skin and skull of the subject, was, I take it, pretty much universally held. So, you know, so the idea that could be uncontroversial, I think, is really interesting. It's certainly true the extended mind, on the face of it, looks like a stronger thesis. I mean, what's problematic here as well is that, remember, Clark and Chalmers say, what they actually say in that paper about, you know, beliefs being outside the head isn't really what they mean. You know, because beliefs aren't anywhere, right? They're not. So that doesn't really help, you know, because it makes the extended mind thesis look more dramatic than it is. But, you know, Otto doesn't have beliefs in his notebook, you know, but you don't have beliefs in your brain either, right? So But once you jettison that and just think of it, well, beliefs are just sort of properties of a person, and the personhood in the relevant sense is extending outside. Well, then now it starts to look, it's less contentious. But now, of course, the connection with the cognitive looks stronger, because it looks very much like, well, certainly, we're making assessments of belief. Well, aren't we now thinking of this in terms of the cognitive structure? Cognitive used in a way that's not implying anything good about it, like you're forming true beliefs, just that you're forming beliefs, right? So in that general sense of cognitive. Yeah, so I think those are the issues, really. Do you think the cognitive is the mark of the mental?
Yes, thank you so much. Because with this kind of accounts of extended mind, you could think like mind and cognition is the same thing. Just because you were saying a notebook could be a thing that contains beliefs, that contains wishes, and other sort of things. Thank you so much.
Oh, sorry, quick follow-up before Lorena. So you, following up on what you said, you think epistemic bloating is not a real problem, or is a problem that comes from thinking beliefs can be embodied?
Yeah, So my view is that the threshold for extended cognition probably should be a lot higher. So as I said before, I don't. So people like Andy think that extended cognition is everywhere, and in fact, there are lots of people. I know Mike Wheeler thinks that lots of processes even before in early stages of technology, not information processing technologies, but just general technologies of adaptation, environmental adaptation, are also extended cognition. If you think like that, then yeah, obviously you're going to get bloat, because you're going to get mental states spread out again into the world, and then if those can amount to knowledge, then you'll get epistemic bloat. I guess I've never been that. I suppose if I was one of these people, I guess I would just bite the bullet on that. It's not so much a reductio of the view as the view, But the way, on my view, I think that extended cognition, I think of the criteria being quite high. This is why I mentioned neuromedia. I think neuromedia, that would be extended cognition. And so I don't think my smartphone is an extended cognitive process, but I can imagine in the future there being technologies around where it is extended. And when that happens, then yeah, I guess I would bite the bullet and say, well, there would now be lots of things that I know. Just in the sense that I know, right now, there are things that I know. I have to kind of think about it, but I know them, and I count as knowing them, because I can, without actually making any further inquiry, come up with an answer. And I think, well, in the future, there'll be much more things that I can come to know. I don't think that is, the bloat is, of course, pejorative. I think that would just be a consequence of the view.
Okay, thank you very much. Lorena? Yeah. Your microphone is muted.
Sorry. At some point, you were saying that you thought intellectual virtues cannot be offloaded, right? But the examples, the cases you gave of the different projects, in some sense or another, you're saying that, especially in the prison case, right? The teaching of prisoners, it did seem to me like there was a way to teach intellectual virtues to these people. In a way that involved assistive technology, right? Or you think, how do you conceptualize this case, right? Are you thinking that? That's one question, right? I'm not sure how you conceptualize the projects in relation with the idea that intellectual virtues have to be learned and in a way taught as well, right? Not just, and that they are more sort of about the entire cognitive network and how it works in itself, right? That's one thing. And another question, which is different, unrelated question, has to do with responsibility, right? Once you start extending cognition, and I'm thinking about the future as well, right? I mean, thinking about suddenly one starts getting, in a way, my mind can be somewhere, or at least my cognition can be extended in many ways that are not necessarily limited. Then in those cases, the question of epistemic responsibility it arises very seriously, I think, right? I mean, in fact, social media and all other things that we're access to now are raise questions about responsibility that are new. I think are new in a way, right? I mean, many epistemic problems arise in connection with the networks, really, right? The internet and so on. So I don't know if you have anything to say about that.
Yeah, thank you. Both good questions. On the first point, I mean, obviously, I think technology can help. You could maybe do this if you had to over Zoom. I don't think it's ideal, actually. I think there's something interesting about the fact that it's easy to do this in person. The embodied nature of these interactions and why they're easier, I think, is worth studying. But I think it could be done. But I don't think that's technologically enabled. But it wouldn't be a replacement for what's happening there. I mean, what you're doing is, you're learning that. It's really wonderful when you watch this in action over this 7-week program. Watch this change in the prisoners and how they relate to one another. And in fact, as they describe, because we did interviews with the prisoners themselves, they describe it as like, it's like a revelation. I mean, some of them describe how they now start using these techniques. Interestingly, they use them in like meetings with like their probation officer, or because some of them are coming up for release and so on, or meetings with their lawyers and so on. They can see the practical use of thinking about reasons now in a way they hadn't, before, like breaking everything down and indeed they're engaged with. One of the sort of heartbreaking things a lot of prisoners talked about, because these are long-term prisoners, many of them done very serious violent crimes. They talked about how a lot of the violent situations they've been in, they realized now was to do with misunderstandings of others and misunderstandings of themselves, miscommunications. So it's fascinating. So I think that what's going on here is not something, it has to be done. In this case, I think it works very effectively because you have a group working together over time. So as a group idea, the group doesn't change. Once you're in the group, people are allowed to come in and come out, or you're in for the 7 weeks. It's kind of like a therapy type thing. It's not therapy, but it functions a bit like that, It's got that same kind of structure. You've got to play by the rules, you've got to learn the rules, and then and you see this transition, how they relate to one another. And so I would suggest this is a very pure way of teaching, and it's not. I don't see any way of making that, offloadable to technology. And then your second point about responsibility, that's really important. In order for anything to be classed, this goes back to the knowledge bloat point, epistemic bloat. I think in order for it to plausibly be an attribution of knowledge to you, there has to be something about the way in which the processes are integrated with you and with your onboard processes, such that we can still coherently think of you as responsible. So I don't know if you know, so my work about knowledge, I think there is this kind of, there's a virtue element to it. To know is partly like an anti-luck, anti-risk. It's getting to the truth in a non-lucky, non-risky way. But it's also getting to truth in a way that manifests your cognitive agency. And that means it has to be attributable to you that you know, in quite a weak sense, but still it's robust enough to exclude certain kinds of epistemic states as being knowing. And I think, here this would deal with some of the epistemic bloat. There might not be the right kind of integration for some kinds of knowledge to count. But I do think there would be lots of things that you would count as knowing that you didn't before. And I think this actually does have normative implications. So I think, for example, the standard view about ignorance is just a state. It's a state of not knowing or not having a true belief. I think that's wrong. Ignorance, it seems to me, is a normative assessment. It's not knowing or not believing something that you really should have, right? It's an assessment of you as a cognitive subject. And I think what you can be held to account for will change if you have more, and I think this is just the way we make these assessments actually. You know, if you have access to lots of information and you don't do it, then that makes you more ignorant than someone that never had the access in the first place. That's why we don't think children are, I don't think children are ignorant. I mean, there's lots of things they don't know. They're not ignorant. You know, someone who's been locked up in isolation for 20 years, there's lots of things they don't know. They're not ignorant, right? But you know, so in the future, I think that we will be held to account for more things. You know, the normative assessment of us as ignorant will increase because what we're able to know increases.
Thank you. Duncan?
Hi, Professor Pritchard. Can you hear me well?
Yes, I can. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question closely related with the late Lorena's question concerning the relationship between education and extended knowledge. And I am just wondering what would be the role education plays in cultivating these intellectual virtues that are knowledge conducive according to virtue reliabilism. I mean, those intellectual virtues that produce true belief by the manifestation of the integrated cognitive ability and so on. So what do you think about the role education plays in the acquisition of knowledge and hence in the attribution of epistemic responsibility?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's precisely that education is fundamentally about developing intellectual character. So it's not primarily about giving you knowledge and skills. It is about that, but it's about that as a means to developing these higher order traits, which, I mean, I don't take a reliabilist view of I mean, I think they are reliable traits, but I think there's more to them than just reliable traits. So I wouldn't be a reliabilist virtue epistemologist. I take that this is the neo-Aristotelian view. Is more, there are different features of the intellectual virtues than just simply, there are more features than just their reliability. I mean, in particular, this motivational state, I think that the role of reflection in their acquisition and so on, these are all things that are more difficult to accommodate in reliabilist terms. But I think this is precisely what we are doing in education. And I think this is, in fact, what good education looks like. It is about giving people these this is why, for example, we want people to learn for themselves, to work things out for themselves, to be autonomous and so on, because we're trying to help them develop an intellectually virtuous character. Does that answer your question? Is that what you're after?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. We have time for more questions. Well, I have two questions unrelated, but please feel free to answer one or both or not. The first is, would you say, or would you share my view that there is a problematic assumption in these debates that our non-assisted, non-aided cognition is very, very integrated, whereas, for instance, people working on cognitive biases and dual process theory have tried to show that this isn't the case, or something that comes to mind, for instance, is an experiment where people are presented with a Müller-Lyer illusion and judge one line to be longer than the other, but then they are asked to manipulate the lines, and they do it with the correct length. So that's supposed to show that there is not really an integration between the sensimotor task and the visual perception. That's one question, and the other question is what would you think on the view that there are some epistemic virtues that are good in themselves, but can be not, I don't know if not virtues, but can have negative consequences in the social context. For instance, intellectual audacity. I'm presupposing that it may have something to, well, in certain contexts, you might manifest that by speaking your mind and not accepting the first answer that you are giving. And I'm thinking that for instance, in our social context in Mexico, that might be viewed in a positive light for men, for instance, or for boys in school, but not for women. So if you teach that kind of virtue in an education setting, then the boys will reap benefits from that, but the girls will be viewed as rude or ambitious, etc. So to what extent that should be, the social context should be taken into account before deciding which virtues should be good. So those are my two questions.
Okay, those are great questions. On the first one, I mean, of course, it's true that there are lots of cases where people seem to have inconsistent attitudes or are not integrated, as you say, beliefs and so forth. Yeah, I mean, and I think that's just simply a fact about human cognition. But of course, you know, that's not in itself in tension with a conception of good intellectual character as, you know, integrated. But because, of course, these are sort of, these are, on the face of it, they're sort of anomalous, right? They're significant precisely because they're anomalous. You know, generally, in the normal run of events, things are pretty well integrated, and then these odd cases emerge where they're not. So if that's the right way to think about it, then that's compatible with the virtue stuff, because the virtue stuff isn't claiming that, you know, people have sort of perfect cognition or anything. There are more serious challenges, though. I mean, the more serious one, of course, is situationism, which would take us into territory. But I mean, if you know, situationism is because that situation. I mean, for those of you who don't know, the idea is that you explain most of our behavior is best explained in terms of situational factors rather than in terms of broad character traits like virtues. A lot of the focus is on the moral case, but if it works in the moral case, it should be a work in the intellectual virtues case. Some people like Mark Alfano have worked on this. Yes, that's a bigger challenge, because it's not just talking about anomalous cases. It's saying, like, in general, we explain behavior better this way than that way. And in fact, if that's right, it would be a reason to think that we don't have these traits, or at least if we have them, they're not playing any explanatory role in our behavior. So if that's kind of equivalent to saying we don't have them. I mean, I've argued elsewhere, I think the situation's challenge, I think, is over-egged. But yeah, if it were true, then that would be a bigger problem, precisely because it's general and it's not anomalous. There are other interesting issues about how cognition works. I mean, Andy's view, he thinks most of the cognitive, because of course he has his predictive coding view, he thinks a lot of the important cognitive processes are subpersonal. And so he thinks it's a mistake to put everything at the personal level, which is what we're effectively doing. And that's really interesting. That's something I need to think about. So he has a way of thinking about virtue epistemology, which is like sort of subpersonal virtue epistemology. You know, the mind is a Bayesian machine, and then you think of these subpersonal processes as governing this. And again, that would be a case where assumptions about how ordinary cognition works have a bearing on how you think this pans out. Yeah, so I'm not saying I'm not hostage to cognitive science, because obviously I am. But you know, maybe in some ways more than others, you know. And then on the other point, yeah, this is really interesting. I mean, just putting the point in reverse, I don't know if you've come across this idea of Mandevillian intelligence. There's a guy called Paul Smart, who's a computer scientist. When we did the Extended Knowledge Project, we got to work with him, really interesting guy. He became fascinated by virtue epistemology and so on, and started writing. He's a computer scientist. He now has lots of papers on applied epistemology. But one of his papers is on Mandevillian intelligence. He thinks that a lot of our cognitive traits are, so this is kind of the inverse of the case you imagine. They're vices, but it doesn't matter that they're vices, because collectively they become virtues. So certain kinds of vices in the individual, when manifest in a group, well, they'll cancel each other out in such a way you have a sort of socially you have a virtue. And I guess so it's kind of the inverse. Your case would be like a case where individually it's a virtue, but in some sense collectively or socially it becomes a vice. And you know, these I think these are fascinating cases. Are there structurally any cases of that sort? I don't know. I mean, it's possible. I don't know. I'd have to think about it. I mean, I was never convinced by the Mandevillian cases that Paul had, but yeah, but if there's Mandevillian intelligence, then presumably you can invert it and have whatever the opposite of that is. There was something else implicit in your question, though, which was about the sort of the social dynamic in which virtues are embedded. And that is very important. It's something we're very conscious of with the Intellectual Virtues Project, because we don't want it to be, there's a real danger with a project like that, that you sort of you sort of privilege a certain Eurocentric way of thinking about ideas, rationality, and so on. We're not trying to do that. So that's why we bring in non-Western perspectives. The virtues appear in lots of different traditions. It might not be called the virtues, but the same general ideas. The Confucian traditions, for example, in India, there's classical Indian philosophy has similar ideas and so on. So you don't have to tie it to ancient Greece or anything like that. But UCI, we have a very diverse campus. I mean, only 15% of our students are white students. I mean, that's quite an incredible statistic, actually, when you think about it. So, and many of the students are from the Far East and so forth. So we have to think about what the impact of these virtues might be. And I must confess, this is sort of underexplored. This is what we're trying to do as we go along. I don't think we can take for granted that, as you say, there may be certain kinds of virtues which you can inculcate in people, which in certain, I'm thinking of people who go, a lot of our students are Chinese, to go back to China. It may be right now, China's not a good place to be intellectually virtuous, or maybe, part of what it is to be intellectually virtuous, have a certain prudential rationality. The phronesis kicks in, and so you recognize when it's maybe wise to be silent. But yeah, I mean, these are important practical issues. And if you're involved in a curriculum project, there are things you have to be thinking about. By the way, we had this same issue with the prisoners in a different way. We did the project and we have to get ethics clearance, a huge ethics clearance. I mean, you're taking students into a prison, with murderers and rapists and so on. Ethics clearance is a nightmare. I mean, absolute nightmare. And there's all these different bodies involved. They all have their own ethics clearance. But what was interesting, no one at any point asked us about our duties to the prisoners beyond sort of data protection type issues. But actually, it was only after we did the project, I started to think, we had this huge impact on these prisoners. What if we could have ruined their lives, actually? We could have had imagine these prisoners, let's suppose they became prisoners who hadn't been assertive hitherto, suddenly become very assertive in their opinions or something. Maybe they could, they're surrounded by very violent people who haven't done this training. We could have, maybe we could have created depression in people or existential crisis or something. And I'm embarrassed to say we never even considered this, and no one asked us to. It's only after the fact we considered this. I think any future project, I would say to people, you have to consider this. This is a real danger. You can't just think that maybe it's good for us, with our students to give them these kind of skills. And generally it's good. You can't just think going into people in very different social situations that this is going to be good for them. And as it happens, it was. But we didn't have any reason to be that confident that would be the case, actually.
Yeah, like living by the categorical imperative in prison might get you killed, for instance.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. Lorena, please, and we have time for one more question if anybody wants. And so.
I'm sorry, so many questions that arise in this context concerning what you were saying. A lot of issues. One is, for example, it came to my mind that there is, capitalism is capitalism in general, however you understand it, I'm not going to define it here, right? But anyways, capitalism has a way to make citizens or people who are more technological, more more worried about getting good jobs and getting more things and so on. And I think that the idea of education increasing or cultivating intellectual character as you define it, right? I think that those two tendencies would and sometimes clash, right? I mean, because I mean, the idea is to get more engineers and more technicians, more things that are at the practical end, and people who do not necessarily think too much and who just want to buy and buy and buy, right? I mean, that's one tendency, social tendency in our societies. And also, but there is this other tendency of, at least of some democracies, right, to make us more like citizens that are reflective and who protest and free and so on, right? I mean, there's all these things, and so I love your project of, you know, the idea that you can cultivate the intellectual character of people, but I don't know that that's necessarily very valued in in our larger, you know, context, social and cultural context, right? So that's one thing. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
So this is something which is very important to the curriculum project. Actually, and I think a lot of people feel this, that our students, and this may reflect the fact that many of them are from they're first generation students, many of them are underrepresented minorities and so on, but they think of education very much instrumentally.
Yeah.
It means to something. It's a commodity that they're consuming, and then it's an economic means to some end. And I can entirely understand why they would think that, particularly in America, where education is very expensive. But we're trying to get them to see that there's more to it. And I do think that it's a subversive idea, and you have to be careful how you pitch it. But the idea of thinking of education as more than just that, and trying to highlight that. And you know, we found this even with the Prisons Project. We always, when we were talking to policymakers, we never mentioned philosophy. We said it was critical thinking and so on. And we mentioned instrumental goods like recidivism rates and so on. If we'd said it was about, you know, giving people intellectual self-respect and teaching them, I mean, aside from anything else, we were terrified that the media would get hold of this. And because I mean, some of these people have done terrible things, or child murderers and so on. And you can imagine the right-wing media getting hold of this. Oh, there's money being spent on giving these people these extra classes. You know, how outrageous is that? Teaching them philosophy. Why are they being taught for? You know, so yeah, we have to be very careful, because I think a lot of these things are very subversive. And by the way, the most subversive thing about all of this is the care and concern for the truth. And I try and get that into the students. I don't know if you find this back in Mexico City. Students seem to think that the subversive idea is not caring about the truth. And I personally think that's a product of capitalist society wanting amenable citizens, right?
Exactly.
So I think, and again, you know, I'm not going to say that. I'm not going to go talk to the chancellor and say that's what I think. I mean, I think actually the chancellor would agree with me, but that would be politically subversive. But I think that is part of what's going on. You care about the truth. Well, that has all kinds of implications for your life, practical ones, political ones.
I agree. Yeah.
Of course, this is a product of the modern day. That you have to hide your political opinions when you do these, and be very careful how you present them.
I know.
I'm sure it's probably, you know, it's funny, different places how you feel the pressures in different ways. You know, I'm you know, moved from Scotland to America, I feel different kinds of pressures, you know, and I'm sure, you know, other countries.
Of course, yeah.
If you're teaching in Hong Kong or somewhere like that, my God, it'd be far worse.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, here in Mexico, we do not necessarily have as marked a tendency towards thinking that cultivating your intellect is necessarily a bad thing. But I do think that those are two conflicting tendencies in the wider social, you know, structures. Yeah. Another thing, if I can ask you something else, sorry, it is related to this, and has to do with assistive technology in poor countries, right? I mean, as you said, assistive technology is very expensive sometimes, you know, and so Because I was thinking, I'm sure that there could be very many ways in which technology can assist people who have cognitive issues, but the problem is that these technologies won't seem to ever be able to be widely available to all the people who would need it, or who would benefit from it, right? And so, yeah, that's one of the issues that worries me, right? I mean, it may help some subset of the people who need it, and that's great. But I don't think that, given the global tendencies, economic tendencies in the entire world, right? I mean, this could ever be something that would be available necessarily to most, or even, not all, but not even most people, So
this this feeds into a general issue about cognitive augmentation and how it's going. That you're going to have different types of people. The cognitive augmentation is not going to be developed in a way that's universal. And there's lots of ethical issues raised by this. I think actually a lot of the technology, although it's expensive, there's no reason why it should be. I had a student, an amazing PhD student, and we admitted him to Edinburgh. From India, he'd won a Commonwealth scholarship, really hard to get. None of us paid any, when we read the application, none of us paid any attention to, there's a section about like disability and so on. We never read that. We just read the academic stuff. When he arrived, it turns out he was completely blind. He'd never left the city where he lived in India before. He traveled by himself from India to Edinburgh. I just can't, several connecting flights. I don't know, I can't even get my head around this. Well, I mean, how does one do that? But he had, he didn't come from a wealthy country, he didn't come from a wealthy background. He had adapted like basically certain apps and smartphone things and things that you can get, various devices anyway. Some of it was engineered for blind people, but some of it was just general apps which he adapted for his purpose, apps that read things out to him and so on, things like that. And he had this he was like in a sort of technological bubble as he traveled around. And he just did adapting. And by the way, an astonishing amount of intellectual virtue is required to be this kind of person. And now he went into Edinburgh and did a PhD. I mean, I just find that, you never left your city before. And now the first time you leave, you travel halfway around the world by yourself and you can't see. Incredible. But yeah, it can be done. I think, and I suspect this is the future, as often is the case. People adapt what's available and they find routes to it.
Yeah, of course.
Well, thank you very much for coming. It was great having you here. It's great to hear these foundational issues in epistemology connected with applied issues in education and learning and society in general. I think we should work a lot more in those areas. So thank you very much for showing us this project.
Well, thanks. This is what I really want to do. I try and get people, epistemologists, to do more applied epistemology. I think we should do more of it.
Well, we're very much behind applied ethics.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Well, thanks again for inviting me and for all your questions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.